The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminates a small, cluttered office tucked away in the basement of the Millfield Historical Society. Outside, rain taps steadily against the single window that sits just above ground level, casting watery shadows across the room's wood-paneled walls. A woman in her mid-30s sits hunched over an antique wooden desk, its surface barely visible beneath stacks of aged photographs, yellowed documents, and meticulously labeled archival boxes. This is Eleanor Wright, lead archivist at the Historical Society for the past 7 years. Her dark hair is tied back in a messy bun, escaped tendrils framing her face, and wire-rimmed glasses perch on her nose as she carefully examines a collection of sepia-toned photographs with white cotton gloves. The office around her is a testament to her dedication. Floor-to-ceiling shelves overflow with leather-bound books and acid-free storage boxes. A state-of-the-art scanner sits beside an antique typewriter, and the walls are adorned with framed maps of Millfield dating back to its founding in 1842. The air carries the distinct smell of old paper and preservation chemicals, a scent Eleanor has come to associate with home more than her own apartment. She gently lifts a photograph of Millfield's Main Street circa 1910, studying the horse-drawn carriages and women in long skirts with their parasols through her magnifying glass. The quiet solitude of her work, the delicate dance of preserving history while uncovering its secrets, has always brought her peace. Today, however, a strange restlessness disturbs her usual calm, a peculiar sensation that something significant is about to change. A gentle knock on the open door makes Eleanor look up. A young man stands in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat onto the worn hardwood floor. He's carrying a cardboard box that appears to have been hastily sealed with packing tape, water spots darkening its corners. "Ms. Wright? I'm Thomas Hayes," he says with a nervous smile, shifting the box in his arms. "I called earlier about my grandmother's collection." Eleanor stands and offers a warm smile, smoothing down her navy pencil skirt. "Yes, of course. Please, come in, let me help you with that." She hurries around the desk, but Thomas shakes his head. "I've got it, thanks. Just need somewhere to set it down. It's heavier than it looks." Eleanor quickly clears a space on the edge of her desk, moving aside a stack of town council minutes from 1925 that she'd been organizing earlier. Thomas sets the box down with a small grunt of relief. Water has seeped through the bottom, leaving a dark stain on the polished wood. "Oh, I'm so sorry about that," Thomas says, noticing the mark. "The storm caught me by surprise. It wasn't supposed to rain until tonight." "Don't worry about it," Eleanor assures him, already reaching for a cloth from her desk drawer. "This desk has survived worse in its 100-plus years. It was originally from the mayor's office in the 1890s. She dabs at the water, then turns her attention back to Thomas. "Thank you for coming in despite the weather. You said on the phone these belonged to your grandmother?" Thomas runs a hand through his damp hair, nodding. "Yes. After Gran passed last month, we found these in her attic. Most of the family photos we're keeping, of course, but there were all these other photographs and items that seem historical. I thought maybe the society would be interested." His eyes wander around the office, taking in the carefully preserved artifacts of Millfield's past. "Gran always said history shouldn't be forgotten." Eleanor gestures to a worn leather chair across from her desk. "We're always grateful for donations, especially from old Millfield families like the Hayes. Your grandmother was Margaret Hayes, correct? I think I met her once at our Victorian Christmas exhibition a few years ago." Thomas nods, sitting down on the creaking chair. "Yes, though she was born Margaret Sullivan. And you probably did meet her. She never missed those Christmas exhibitions. She loved all the old ornaments and decorations." His expression softens with memory. "Gran was 92 when she passed, and sharp as a tack right until the end. She never threw anything away. Said you never know what might become important later." He taps the box with his finger. "Some of these photos go back to the early 1900s, I think. Maybe even earlier." Eleanor pulls on a fresh pair of white cotton gloves from the box on her desk. The Sullivan family has deep roots in Millfield, too. They were among the founding families, if I remember correctly. She pauses, thinking. "Sullivan's Creek on the north side of town was named after them, wasn't it?" "That's right," Thomas confirms. "My great-great-grandfather had a mill there in the 1870s. Gran used to tell stories about it." Eleanor carefully begins to sort through the box's contents, gently lifting out the items one by one. The familiar thrill of discovery, of touching history, runs through her as she places each piece on her desk. She pulls out bundles of photographs carefully tied with faded blue ribbon, letters wrapped in tissue paper that has yellowed with age, and small trinkets that speak of lives long past. a tarnished silver thimble, a pocket watch with an ornate chain, a child's tiny leather shoe. "These are in remarkable condition," she comments, carefully examining a sepia-toned family portrait showing a stern-faced couple surrounded by 5 children in their Sunday best. The photograph is mounted on thick cardboard with the photographer's name, Wilfred Tanner, photographic artist, embossed in gold at the bottom. "Your grandmother must have taken great care in storing these." She turns the photograph over, noting a date written in faded ink. "Christmas, 1896. Did your grandmother ever mention anything specific about these items? Any stories about the people in the photographs?" Eleanor asks, continuing her careful examination of the collection. Thomas shakes his head, leaning forward to look at the family portrait. "Not really. I mean, she had so many stories, but near the end, her memory wasn't what it used to be. She'd start talking about someone from her childhood, then drift into another story altogether." He points to a young girl in the photograph, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. "That might be Gran herself, though. The age would be about right." Eleanor nods, placing the photograph carefully to one side. "We can cross-reference it with other records in our archives. It's amazing how much we can piece together when we have enough fragments of the past." She continues sorting through the items, methodically creating categories on her desk. Photographs in one pile, documents in another, personal effects in a third. The historian in her is already constructing narratives, connecting these artifacts to the broader tapestry of Millfield's history. "I do remember her always wearing this unusual wedding ring, though," Thomas says suddenly, watching Eleanor work. "It had this dark stone that she said was special. Not a diamond like most wedding rings. Almost black, but when the light hit it just right, you could see all these colors inside. Like a rainbow trapped in darkness," she used to say. Eleanor pauses, her interest piqued. "That sounds like it might have been an opal. Black opals are quite rare and valuable." "Maybe. I never knew what kind of stone it was, just that it seemed important to her. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at it, turning it this way and that in the light. When I asked her about it once, she just said it was a family heirloom that protected her." Thomas shrugs. "Kid me thought that was cool. A magic ring like in the stories. Adult me figured it was just something she treasured because it had belonged to someone she loved." Eleanor continues sorting through the items, her trained eye noting the quality of the photographs, the style of clothing that helps date them, the formal poses typical of early photography when subjects had to remain still for long exposures. She pauses when she comes across a small velvet box. Its once rich purple now faded to a dusty lavender. She opens it carefully, revealing an ornate gold wedding ring with a dark, oval-shaped stone. "Is this the ring you mentioned?" she asks, holding it up to the light that filters through the rain-streaked window. The craftsmanship is exquisite. The gold band is intricately carved with a pattern of twining vines and small flowers. The setting holding the dark stone appears almost like delicate fingers cradling a precious egg. Thomas leans forward, his eyes widening in surprise. "Yes, that's it exactly, but that's impossible. I thought it was buried with her." That was her explicit wish in her will, that the ring should go with her to her final rest. "My mother and I were there when the funeral director placed it on her finger before they closed the casket." Eleanor examines the ring more closely, turning it in her gloved hands. The stone does indeed appear to be a black opal. In the dim light of the office, it looks almost completely black, but as she tilts it toward the lamp, flashes of blue, green, and crimson fire ignite within its depths, like embers in a dying coal. "It's a black opal, almost certainly from Australia," she says, drawing on her knowledge of historical jewelry. "They were quite rare and valuable in the early 1900s, especially ones of this size and quality. Lightning Ridge in New South Wales had just begun producing them commercially around 1903, and they became sought-after status symbols among the wealthy." She turns the ring gently, watching how the stone catches the light, revealing new patterns of color with each movement. The opal seems to have a life of its own, the colors shifting and swimming beneath its glossy surface. "There's an inscription inside the band," she notes, squinting to make out the tiny, elegant engraving in the gold. She reaches for her magnifying glass to read the delicate script. It says ES to CS, forever bound, June 12, 1908. "Does that mean anything to you?" she asks, looking up at Thomas. Thomas frowns slightly, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Sullivan was my grandmother's maiden name, so maybe relatives. I know there was a Catherine Sullivan in the family tree. My grandmother mentioned her a few times. Some kind of cousin, I think, but I don't know who ES would be. Probably Catherine's husband." Eleanor suggests. If the ring is dated 1908, it would likely be her wedding ring. E.S. would be the husband giving it to C.S. Catherine Sullivan. June 12th would be their wedding date. Eleanor carefully places the ring back in its box and continues sorting through the items. She pauses when she finds a small envelope containing what appears to be a photograph of the ring itself. How unusual, she murmurs, carefully removing the photograph. Someone took a detailed photograph of just the ring. The photograph shows the ring placed against a dark fabric background, the stone prominently displayed. The photo has surprising clarity for something from the early 1900s, suggesting it was taken by a professional photographer using the best equipment available at the time. Photography was still quite formal and expensive back then, Eleanor explains, showing the photograph to Thomas. Cameras were large, unwieldy things, and the process was time-consuming. People didn't typically take photos of objects like this unless they were documenting something for insurance purposes or scientific study. She studies the image more closely. The quality suggests a professional studio photographer. It would have been expensive and unusual to commission such a specific image. This suggests the ring had special significance beyond being just a wedding band. Thomas leans in to look at the photograph, his eyes moving between it and the actual ring in its open box. Gran always said there was something special about that ring. She'd stare at it sometimes, like she was looking for something inside it. I always thought it was just sentimental value, memories of my grandfather or something. But he had a plain gold band. Nothing like this. Eleanor sets the photograph aside, her curiosity deepening. She continues sorting through the box, handling each item with the care it deserves. Among old receipts, newspaper clippings, and more family photographs, she finds a book bound in worn brown leather, its spine cracked with age. Unlike the mass-produced books of the era, with their embossed titles and uniform bindings, this appears to be a personal journal, handmade or perhaps custom-bound by a bookbinder. There is no title on the cover, only a small, hand-tooled design, an intricate circular pattern that, upon closer inspection, resembles the setting of the opal ring. Eleanor carefully opens the journal, the binding creaking slightly in protest. The yellowed pages are filled with elegant handwriting in faded brown ink, the script flowing and precise in the manner taught to well-educated young women of the early 1900s. Catherine Sullivan, 1908, she reads from the inside cover, her pulse quickening at the connection. The name matches the CS from the ring's inscription. This appears to be your great-grandmother's journal, or your grandmother's cousin, more precisely. Thomas looks surprised, leaning forward with renewed interest. I had no idea this existed. What does it say? Is it about the ring? Eleanor carefully turns a few pages, scanning the elegant script. The journal appears to be a daily record of Catherine Sullivan's life in 1908, beginning in April of that year. Random passages catch Eleanor's eye, mentions of wedding preparations, family disagreements, and increasingly, references to a fiancé named Edward. Edward Stone, Eleanor murmurs, making the connection. E.S. from the inscription. She looks up at Thomas. Your grandmother's cousin Catherine appears to have been engaged to a man named Edward Stone in 1908. This journal seems to document their engagement and presumably their marriage. She turns a few more pages, careful not to damage the fragile paper. I'll need time to go through all of this properly. There's too much here to read quickly, and the paper is quite delicate. She closes the journal gently. Would you be willing to let us keep these items for further examination? We can digitize everything and provide you with copies, of course. The originals would be preserved in our archive, properly credited to your family. Thomas nods, his earlier discomfort about the ring seemingly forgotten in the excitement of discovering this direct link to his family's past. Of course, that's why I brought them here. I thought they might be important to local history, but I had no idea there'd be something like a journal. My mother will be thrilled. She's been working on our family genealogy for years. The Sullivan family has deep roots in Millfield, Eleanor says, carefully gathering the items she's examined. This journal could provide valuable insights not just into your family history, but into life in this town during the early 1900s. Personal accounts like these are invaluable to historians. They show us the human side of history, not just the dates and facts. Thomas stands, checking his watch. I should get going. I have a meeting at 2. But please take all the time you need with these. It's what Gran would have wanted. She was always saying history should be preserved. He smiles. She used to drag me here to the Historical Society when I was a kid. I complained then, but now I'm glad she did. Eleanor walks him to the door, promising to call once she's had time to properly catalog and examine the collection. After Thomas leaves, she returns to her desk, drawn irresistibly back to the unusual ring and photograph. There's something about them that feels different from the typical historical artifacts she handles daily, something that tugs at her historian's instinct for a story untold. She carefully re-examines the photograph of the ring, noting the careful composition, the way the opal is positioned to catch the light perfectly. Someone went to considerable expense and trouble to document this particular piece of jewelry. But why? Using her magnifying glass, she peers more closely at the image. Under magnification, the opal's surface reveals intricate patterns within its play of color, swirls and eddies of blue, green, and crimson against the black background. But there's something else, something she hadn't noticed at first glance. The patterns aren't random. In the center of the stone, where the colors converge most intensely, there seems to be a shape, almost like the suggestion of a face. Eleanor blinks, adjusting the magnifying glass. It must be pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar patterns, especially faces, in random stimuli, like seeing shapes in clouds or the man in the moon. Yet the longer she stares at the magnified image, the more distinct the impression becomes. There is definitely a face-like formation within the opal's natural variations. The suggestion of eyes, a nose, a mouth set in what might be a smile or a grimace. That's strange, she whispers to herself, a chill running down her spine despite the stuffiness of the basement office. She sets down the magnifying glass and looks at the photograph with her naked eye. The face isn't visible without magnification, just the beautiful swirl of colors in the black stone. She picks up the magnifying glass again, and there it is, unmistakable once seen. Eleanor looks from the photograph to the actual ring in its velvet box. Does the stone itself contain the same pattern? With a slightly trembling hand, she picks up the ring and examines it under the magnifying glass. The opal's colors shift and dance as she moves it under the light. But yes, there it is. The same suggestion of a face, perhaps even clearer in the actual stone than in the photograph. Not a trick of the photographic process then, but a feature of the opal itself. She sets the ring down carefully, feeling unaccountably disturbed. Black opals often contain natural patterns, of course, that's part of their value and appeal. But this particular pattern, and the fact that someone found it significant enough to photograph in such detail over a century ago, strikes her as peculiar. Eleanor glances at the journal, tempted to begin reading it immediately, but a glance at the clock reminds her of her responsibilities. She has a meeting with the board in 30 minutes to discuss the upcoming exhibition on Millfield's industrial history. The journal and ring will have to wait until later. With reluctance, Eleanor places the ring and photograph in the Society's secure storage, a climate-controlled room with proper archival containers designed to preserve delicate historical items. The journal, however, she slips into her leather messenger bag. Board policy permits taking home items for research purposes, provided they're properly logged out, which she does meticulously. There's something about Catherine Sullivan's story that calls to her, demanding attention more urgently than the routine cataloging that would otherwise occupy her evening. The rain has stopped by the time Eleanor leaves the Historical Society, but the sky remains heavy with clouds, casting a premature twilight over Millfield's streets. The town looks different in this light, the Victorian storefronts and century-old elm trees taking on a somber, almost ominous quality. Eleanor has lived in Millfield all her life, but sometimes, especially when immersed in its history, she feels the weight of all the lives lived here before her, the triumphs and tragedies, the secrets kept and revealed over the generations. As she drives home, her mind keeps returning to the face in the opal. Was it intentionally carved that way, or a natural formation that someone recognized and valued? And why would Margaret Hayes claim she wanted to be buried with the ring, only for it to appear in a box of donations to the Historical Society? Eleanor's apartment is on the third floor of a converted textile mill that once employed half the town. The renovation preserved the building's industrial character, exposed brick walls, towering windows, wooden beams crossing high ceilings. She's filled the space with books and vintage photographs she's collected over the years, creating a home that bridges past and present in much the same way her work does. She kicks off her shoes at the door and hangs her damp coat on the rack, then heads straight to the kitchen to put on the kettle. While waiting for the water to boil, she unpacks her bag, placing Catherine Sullivan's journal reverently on the kitchen table. There's something intimate about reading someone else's private thoughts, especially someone long dead who never intended their words for other eyes. Eleanor always approaches such documents with respect, aware of the privilege and responsibility that comes with being perhaps the first person in generations to hear these silenced voices. Tea made, Earl Grey with a splash of milk. She sits at her kitchen table with Catherine Sullivan's journal open before her. The first entry is dated April 2nd, 1908, the handwriting neat and controlled, though Eleanor can detect an underlying excitement in the slightly rushed formation of certain letters. She begins to read, the handwritten pages transporting her back to Millfield as it existed over a century ago. April 2nd, 1908. Father has finally relented. After months of objections and delays, he has given his blessing, and Edward and I are to be married in June. 2 months seems an eternity to wait, but after 3 years of patience and persuasion, I suppose I can endure a little longer. Edward says his position at the First National Bank of Millfield is secure now that Mr. Holloway has promoted him to head cashier, and we can afford the small house on Elm Street that we've had our eye on since Christmas. It needs work. The roof requires patching, and the kitchen is woefully outdated, but Edward promises we will make it beautiful together. I already envision blue curtains in the front parlor and perhaps a small garden where I can grow the herbs Mother taught me to use. Mother is already consumed with wedding preparations, as if making up for her earlier reservations about Edward. The guest list grows daily, though I've told her repeatedly that I wish for a small ceremony with only family and close friends. Father says appearances must be maintained for a family of our standing. The Sullivans have always been respected in Millfield, he reminds me, and my wedding must reflect our position in society. As if I could forget, with the constant reminders of our family's legacy in this town, Sullivan's Creek, Sullivan Street, even the stained glass window in St. Michael's donated by grandfather after the fire of 1879. Edward gave me the most peculiar look today when I mentioned Mother's plans for 5 bridesmaids and a reception for 70 guests, almost as if he wanted to tell me something but thought better of it. His eyes, those expressive hazel eyes that first drew me to him at the Millfield Autumn Dance 3 years ago, clouded over briefly before he forced a smile. When I pressed him, asking if he objected to such a large affair, he merely smiled that secretive smile of his and said he had a special surprise for me, something unique for our wedding day that would make it unlike any other in Millfield's history. I cannot imagine what it might be, but Edward has always had a flair for the unexpected. It was one of the qualities that made Mother disapprove of him initially. She called him dramatic and unseemly for a banker, but it is one of the many things I love about him. Life with Edward Stone will never be dull. Eleanor flips through more pages, scanning entries about wedding preparations, family disagreements, and Catherine's hopes for her future with Edward. The journal entries document the typical concerns of a bride-to-be in 1908. Discussions about china patterns and linens, worries about the weather for the outdoor reception, minor conflicts between family members over seating arrangements and music selections. Catherine writes with warmth and humor about these mundane matters, revealing herself to be intelligent and observant, if perhaps somewhat sheltered by her privileged upbringing. Edward Stone appears frequently in the entries, though often in passing references rather than detailed descriptions. Catherine clearly adores him, but Eleanor notes an interesting pattern. While Catherine writes at length about her own feelings and those of her family members, she rarely speculates about Edward's thoughts or feelings. He remains somewhat opaque in her accounts, his actions recorded, but his motivations often left unexplored. The journal entries are relatively mundane until Eleanor reaches an entry from late May, where Catherine's elegant handwriting shows subtle changes, slightly larger, with more pressure applied to the pen, suggesting heightened emotion as she wrote. May 27th, 1908. Edward took me to meet the most unusual man today. After our luncheon at Peterson's tea room, instead of returning me to home as expected, he directed our carriage down a narrow side street I've rarely had occasion to visit. When I asked where we were going, he merely smiled that mysterious smile that both charms and frustrates me, and said he had someone important for me to meet regarding our wedding. The carriage stopped before a small shop tucked between the tobacconist and Miller's dry goods on that narrow street behind the courthouse. I would have walked past it 100 times without noticing it, the window display so dusty and the sign so faded that I had to squint to make out the name. Drake & Sons, Jewelers Est, 1847. Edward helped me down from the carriage with unusual solemnity, as if we were arriving at church rather than a shop. "This won't take long," he promised, though something in his voice suggested the visit held more significance than his casual words implied. The shop's interior was unlike any jewelry establishment I've visited before. Dimly lit with heavy velvet curtains blocking much of the daylight, the air thick with the scent of something I couldn't quite identify, something earthy and foreign. Strange artifacts and unusual gems were displayed in glass cases that appeared far older than the building itself, their brass fittings tarnished with age. The proprietor emerged from behind a beaded curtain at the sound of the small bell that announced our entry. Mr. Ambrose Drake appeared to be in his 60s, though something about his movements suggested a younger man. His silver hair was longer than is fashionable for gentlemen in Millfield, falling to his shoulders in waves that reminded me of illustrations of Old Testament prophets in Father's Bible. His eyes were startlingly pale, almost colorless, and seemed to assess me with uncomfortable intensity as Edward made the introductions. "Miss Sullivan," Mr. Drake said, taking my gloved hand in his. He did not shake it as custom dictates, but held it for a moment, his thumb pressing against my wrist in a manner that seemed overly familiar. "Mr. Stone has told me a great deal about you." His accent was difficult to place. Not quite English, not quite continental, with inflections I've never heard before. I withdrew my hand as soon as politeness permitted, fighting an irrational urge to wipe it against my skirt. Edward explained that Mr. Drake is crafting our wedding rings. I was surprised, as I had assumed we would select rings from Harris & Sons on Main Street, where all the best families in Millfield shop for such things. But Edward was insistent that Mr. Drake possesses unique skills in jewelry crafting that make him the only choice for something as important as the symbols of our eternal bond. Mr. Drake's family has been creating extraordinary pieces for generations, Edward told me with unusual animation. His great-grandfather made wedding rings for European royalty. Mr. Drake inclined his head modestly at this praise but did not contradict it. Instead, he invited us to a small room at the back of the shop, separated from the main area by another beaded curtain. This inner sanctum was even more dimly lit than the outer shop, with only a single oil lamp burning on a cluttered workbench. The walls were lined with small drawers labeled in a script I could not decipher, and the ceiling hung with bunches of dried herbs and flowers that contributed to the shop's unusual scent. Mr. Drake showed me several stones for my ring, each nestled in a small velvet box. There were diamonds, of course, but also sapphires, rubies, and more unusual gems I could not name. I was drawn immediately to a dark opal with the most mesmerizing play of colors beneath its surface, blues and greens and flashes of red that appeared and disappeared as the stone moved in the light. When I held it to the lamp, I could almost imagine shapes and patterns shifting within it, like viewing a kaleidoscope or looking into a deep pool of water disturbed by the wind. Before we left, he asked for a small lock of my hair, saying it was an old custom to incorporate something of the bride into the creation of the ring. Edward encouraged me to comply, saying it was a charming tradition. I allowed Mr. Drake to snip a small curl, though the request struck me as peculiar. Edward was unusually quiet on our journey home. When I asked about Mr. Drake, he said only that the man came highly recommended by his colleague at the bank, Mr. James Holloway. Eleanor frowns at this entry, finding the request for Catherine's hair unsettling. She continues reading, flipping forward several pages. June 5, 1908. 1 week until our wedding. Edward collected our rings for Mr. Drake today. Mine is more beautiful than I could have imagined. The opal set in intricate gold that winds around the stone like vines. Edward insists I not wear it until our wedding day. Another tradition, he says. It's bad luck for the bride to wear her wedding ring before the ceremony, he explained, tucking the box safely in his waistcoat pocket. Mr. Drake was most insistent on this point. When I asked to see his ring, he seemed reluctant, but finally showed me a simple gold band with strange markings etched into the metal. Not initials or a date as is customary, but symbols I did not recognize. Intricate patterns that reminded me somewhat of the strange script I had noticed labeling the drawers in Mr. Drake's shop. "What do they mean?" I asked, reaching to touch the unusual engravings. Edward pulled the ring back before my fingers could make contact, returning it to its own velvet box with surprising haste. "Mr. Drake says they're ancient symbols of protection and binding," he said, his tone dismissive as if the subject were of little importance. "Traditions from the old world. Nothing to concern yourself with, my dear." I wanted to press further, to ask why our wedding rings should require symbols of protection, to inquire how Edward had become so invested in these unfamiliar traditions, but he changed the subject abruptly, asking about the final guest count for the reception. By the time our conversation turned to my cousin Beatrice's recent scandalous behavior at the Wilsons' dinner party, the moment to return to the subject of the rings had passed. I am trying not to let it trouble me, but Edward has been different these past weeks, distracted and sometimes absent without explanation. Yesterday, he was meant to call at 3 o'clock to accompany me to select flowers for the church, but sent a messenger instead, claiming unexpected business at the bank required his attention. When I mentioned this to Father at dinner, he seemed surprised, remarking that he had passed the bank at 4 and noted it was already closed for the day. Mother says all men become nervous before their wedding day, and I should not concern myself with such trifles. She speaks of wedding jitters as if they were a common ailment, like a cold or headache that affects all grooms before their nuptials. Father is more practical, saying Edward is likely preoccupied with financial matters, as married life brings new responsibilities and expenses. He suggests that Edward may be working additional hours to ensure our future security. These explanations sound reasonable, and yet they do not fully account for the change I perceive in Edward. It is not merely that he is distracted or absent, but that when he is with me, he sometimes seems like a different person. His familiar mannerisms overlaid with something new and unfamiliar, like an actor who has not fully settled into his role. Still, I cannot shake the feeling that something has changed. At times I catch him watching me with an expression I cannot interpret. Not quite sadness, not quite fear, but something in between. Eleanor feels a chill as she reads these words. Catherine's growing unease is palpable in her writing. She turns the page to continue reading. June 9th, 1908. 3 days until I become Mrs. Catherine Stone. The house is in chaos with final preparations. My dress was delivered today. Mother's design is more elaborate than I would have chosen, but it is beautiful nonetheless. I had the strangest dream last night. I dreamed I was wearing my wedding dress, standing before the mirror in my bedroom. The house was silent. No servants moving about, no mother calling instructions, no father's footsteps in his study. Just an absolute stillness that seemed to press against my ears like cotton wool. In the dream I was wearing the opal ring, though in reality, it remains in Edward's possession until Saturday. I raised my hand to examine the ring more closely, and as I did, I saw movement within the stone. The colors shifted and swirled, no longer random patterns but purposeful, organized, until a face formed in the opal's depths. Not my own reflection, but a woman's face I did not recognize. She was older than me, perhaps in her 30s, with sharp features and dark hair pulled severely back from a high forehead. Her eyes were the most striking feature, intense and knowing, filled with an emotion I could not name. She opened her mouth as if to speak to me, her lips forming words I could not hear. I leaned closer to the mirror, trying to understand, and her hand, not mine, though it wore my ring, reached out toward me. I felt the glass of the mirror turn liquid beneath my fingertips, and then I woke with a start, my heart pounding so loudly I feared it would wake the entire household. I told no one of this dream. They would think me suffering from wedding nerves. Perhaps that is all it is, my mind creating phantasms from the accumulated stress of the past weeks. Yet it felt so real, so vivid. I can still see her face when I close my eyes, still feel the strange terror that gripped me as her hand reached for mine. Edward returns this evening to discuss final arrangements with Father. I have not seen him in 2 days. I find myself both eager for and strangely apprehensive about his return. I keep thinking of the dream, of the face in the opal, and wondering what it might mean. Is it a warning, a product of my imagination, or something else entirely, something I lack the words to describe? Mother calls for me. The florist has arrived to discuss last-minute changes to the church arrangements. I must put aside these troubling thoughts and focus on the practical matters at hand. In 3 days, I will be Edward's wife, and these strange dreams and doubts will surely fade in the light of our new life together. Edward visits this evening to discuss final arrangements with Father. I have not seen him in 2 days. Mr. Holloway sent word that business at the bank required Edward's attention in the neighboring town of Westfield. I find it odd that he did not tell me of these plans himself. Eleanor is so engrossed in the journal that she doesn't notice how late it's grown. Outside her window, darkness has fallen completely. She makes herself another cup of tea and continues reading. June 11th, 1908. 1 day remains. The house is filled with flowers and relatives arriving from out of town. Aunt Gertrude and Uncle Philip arrived from Boston this afternoon. Cousin Lillian will join them tomorrow morning. Edward finally returned from Westfield. He seems exhausted, with dark circles beneath his eyes. When I expressed concern, he assured me all was well, merely the strain of work and wedding preparations. He seemed eager to leave after speaking with Father, hardly staying 10 minutes in my company. As he was preparing to leave, I asked if he had brought the rings back from Westfield, assuming he would have kept them with him. A strange expression crossed his face, almost alarm, before he composed himself and assured me they were safe in the inner pocket of his waistcoat, patting his chest to demonstrate. "I haven't let them out of my possession," he said, and something in his tone suggested this was more than the natural caution one might exercise with valuable items. There was an intensity to his words that seemed disproportionate to the circumstance. I was about to ask more, about his trip, about the banking matter that had called him away so suddenly, when we were interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Thornton, come to discuss some final details of the ceremony. By the time the Reverend departed, Edward had already made his excuses and left, promising to return punctually for the rehearsal dinner at 7 tomorrow evening. I overheard a curious exchange between Edward and Father in the study before his departure. I had gone to bring them tea and paused outside the door when I heard my name mentioned in tones that suggested something more serious than wedding arrangements. "Catherine must never know," Edward said, his voice tense in a way I have never heard before. There was a quality to it, almost desperate, that made me catch my breath. Father's reply was too quiet to discern, but Edward responded with greater intensity. "It is the only way to protect her, to protect all of us." They noticed me then, as I entered with the tea tray, and their conversation ceased immediately. Father looked troubled, his brow furrowed in the way it does when business matters take a concerning turn, but Edward forced a smile and asked about my wedding dress, as if they had been discussing nothing more significant than the weather. I wanted to demand an explanation, to ask what secret they were keeping from me on the eve of my wedding, but something in Father's expression cautioned me against it. Whatever they had been discussing, Father appeared to have sided with Edward, and I know from experience how immovable he can be once his mind is set. I am writing this by candlelight long after the household has retired. The grandfather clock in the hall has just struck midnight. In a few hours, it will be my wedding day. I should be asleep, gathering strength for the momentous occasion ahead, but my mind will not quiet. I keep returning to that fragment of conversation, to Edward's haggard appearance, to the strange dream of the woman in the opal. Tomorrow I marry a man who suddenly seems a stranger to me, a man harboring secrets he shares with my father but not with me. I feel I should confront him, demand to know what he is hiding, but some instinct holds me back. Perhaps after we are married, once we are alone in our new home, he will confide in me whatever burden he carries. Until then, I can only trust that Edward's actions, however puzzling, are motivated by love and concern for my welfare, as he suggested to Father. After all, he has always been protective of me, sometimes to a degree that borders on the excessive. Perhaps this is merely another manifestation of that tendency, magnified by the approach of our wedding day. The wind has risen outside my window, stirring the curtains and making the candle flame dance. The shadows on my wall seem to move with lives of their own, stretching and contracting like living things. I feel watched, though I know I am alone. Perhaps it is only nerves, as Mother would say. Yet I cannot shake the sensation of eyes upon me, of someone, or something, waiting and watching, as the hours tick down to my wedding day. Eleanor pauses in her reading, a chill running down her spine despite the warmth of her apartment. Catherine's growing sense of unease mirrors her own reaction to the journal, the ring, and the photograph. There's something deeply disquieting about Catherine's description of Edward's secretive behavior and her dream of the face in the opal, especially given what Eleanor observed in the actual stone. She turns the page anxiously, now fully invested in Catherine's story. The next entry is dated the wedding day itself, the handwriting noticeably less controlled, with ink blots and crossed-out words, suggesting it was written in haste or emotional distress. June 12, 1908. Morning has arrived, clear and bright, with no trace of the wind that troubled my sleep. In mere hours I will walk down the aisle of St. Michael's Church and pledge myself to Edward for eternity. Mother and the maids are already bustling about, preparing the bathroom for my ritual bath, laying out the undergarments and petticoats that must be donned before the wedding dress itself. There is a nervous excitement in their movements, a sense of momentous occasion that should be infectious but somehow fails to touch me. I feel strangely detached, as if observing the preparations for someone else's wedding. The weather is perfect, clear skies and gentle sunshine, as if nature itself approves of our union. Father has just looked in to tell me the flowers have been delivered to the church without incident, and the caterers are already setting up in the garden for the reception. Everything is proceeding exactly as planned. I should be overjoyed. Yet I slept poorly, troubled again by dreams. The same woman's face in the opal stone, but this time her expression was one of warning, or perhaps plea. She seemed to be trying desperately to communicate something to me, her lips forming words I could not hear, her eyes intense with some emotion I could not identify. I woke in the early hours, my nightgown soaked with sweat despite the mild night, with a sense of foreboding I cannot shake. It lingers still, this feeling of impending calamity. Is this what they call wedding jitters? This bone-deep certainty that something is wrong, that I am making a terrible mistake? Or is it something more? A premonition, a warning my conscious mind cannot fully comprehend, but my dreams are trying to convey. Perhaps I should speak to Father, tell him of my concerns, but what would I say? That I fear my fiancé based on fragments of overheard conversation and strange dreams? That the ring he selected fills me with inexplicable dread? Father would think me hysterical, would attribute my concerns to feminine nerves overwhelmed by the significance of the day. He might even summon Dr. Wilson, who would no doubt prescribe bed rest and perhaps a tonic to calm my overexcited female constitution, as he so often tells his women patients. No, I will proceed as planned. I made a promise to Edward, and I will honor it. Whatever secrets he keeps, whatever troubles him, we will face together as husband and wife. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be abandoned due to vague fears and disturbing dreams. Mother always says that a wife's duty is to stand by her husband through all trials. If Edward faces some challenge he has not yet shared with me, then my place is at his side, supporting him as he confronts it. The clock chimes 9. Mother calls for me from the hall below. It is time to begin preparing for my wedding day. I must set aside these dark thoughts and embrace the joy this day should bring. After all, I have loved Edward for 3 years. Surely that love is stronger than any doubt, any fear, any dream. I will write again tonight, as Mrs. Catherine Stone, and perhaps by then these shadows will have lifted from my heart. The entry ends there. Eleanor turns the page eagerly, but to her surprise, the next several pages have been torn out of the journal, leaving only ragged edges where they once were. The paper texture and aging suggest they were removed long ago, not recently. She carefully examines the torn edges, wondering what those missing pages might have contained. Catherine's account of her wedding day, her wedding night, the beginning of her married life with Edward. The next intact entry is dated 2 weeks later, and Eleanor notes immediately that the handwriting is different, still recognizably Catherine's, but more hurried, less controlled, with sharper angles to the letters and heavier pressure applied to the pen. June 26, 1908. I write this in haste and secrecy, hiding in the small storage room off the kitchen while Edward believes I am visiting Mrs. Patterson next door. He must not know I am keeping this journal. He believes I left it at my parents' home, and I have let him think so. If he knew I was recording these events, I fear what he might do. The Edward I thought I knew, gentle, considerate, rational, has been replaced by someone I hardly recognize, someone whose moods shift like quicksilver, and whose eyes sometimes reflect a calculation that chills me to the bone. I hardly know where to begin. How does one reconcile the life they expected with the reality they now face? The woman I was 2 weeks ago, the bride full of hope and love despite her misgivings, seems a stranger to me now, naive and blind to the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of her perfect life. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful, I suppose, though my memories of it are strangely fragmented, like looking at a shattered mirror where only pieces of the reflection remain. St. Michael's was filled with flowers and family, the stained glass windows casting jewel-toned light across the assembled guests. I walked down the aisle on Father's arm, seeing only Edward waiting for me at the altar. He was handsome in his new charcoal suit, his expression solemn as he watched me approach. There was no trace of the haggard exhaustion I had noted the evening before. His face was composed, his posture straight and confident, his eyes never leaving mine as I moved toward him. When the moment came to exchange rings, I felt a strange reluctance as Edward removed the velvet box from his pocket. Mr. Drake was there, standing in the back of the church, his pale eyes fixed on us with an intensity I found disturbing. I had not expected him to attend, had not even known he had been invited, but there he stood watching as Edward slipped the opal onto my finger. The stone seemed to pulse with an inner light for a moment, and a wave of dizziness passed over me so strongly that I swayed on my feet. Edward steadied me, his hand gripping my elbow, whispering that it was merely the excitement of the day affecting me. Perhaps he was right. The church was warm, the scent of lilies overwhelming, and I had eaten little that morning due to nerves. We completed our vows, and Reverend Thornton pronounced us man and wife. As Edward kissed me, I felt a curious sensation, as if someone else was present, watching us intently, from very nearby. Not Mr. Drake, who remained at the back of the church, but someone else, someone unseen yet undeniably there. I remember pulling back from the kiss, startled by this feeling, and Edward's expression, a flicker of alarm quickly masked by a smile as he turned us to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Edward Stone. The reception at my parents' home passed in a blur of congratulations, champagne toasts, and the constant strain of maintaining a joyful facade while fighting waves of inexplicable dread. Edward remained close to my side throughout, his hand often gripping mine with unnecessary force, especially when James Holloway approached to offer his good wishes. The two men exchanged a look I could not interpret, something that might have been concern or warning passing between them. James looked unwell, I noticed, his complexion sallow and his hands trembling slightly as he raised his glass in our honor. "May your union bring you both exactly what you need," he said, his eyes lingering on my ring rather than meeting my gaze. There was something odd in his emphasis, as if his words carried a meaning beyond the conventional wedding toast. By evening, fatigue overwhelmed me. My head ached terribly, throbbing in time with my pulse, and sounds seemed unnaturally loud. The clink of silverware against china, the laughter of guests, the string quartet in the corner, all amplified to an almost painful degree. Colors, too, appeared too bright, too intense, as if someone had adjusted the world to a higher contrast than normal. Edward noticed my distress and suggested we depart for our new home earlier than planned, an idea my mother initially protested but eventually accepted when she saw how pale I had become. We left amid a shower of rice and well wishes, climbing into the decorated automobile Edward had hired for the occasion. As we drove away, I looked back to see Mr. Drake standing apart from the other guests, watching our departure with an expression that might have been satisfaction or concern. In my distressed state, I could not tell which. Edward drove our automobile through the darkening streets of Millfield to our house on Elm Street. I remember looking down at my ring during the journey, seeing how the opal caught the last light of day. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw eyes looking back at me from within the stone. I blinked, and they were gone, but the sensation of being watched remained. I must have fallen asleep in the automobile, for my next clear memory is of Edward carrying me across the threshold of our new home. The house was dark and quiet, not yet fully furnished as we had planned to complete that task after returning from our honeymoon in Niagara Falls. Edward took me directly upstairs to our bedroom, saying I needed rest, that the excitement and strain of the day had been too much for me. I was too exhausted to protest, too confused by the persistent fog that seemed to have descended over my thoughts. I remember how carefully he removed my wedding ring, holding it up to the lamplight for a moment before placing it in its velvet box on the dresser. As it left my finger, I felt a sudden clarity, as if a veil had been lifted from my mind. The headache that had plagued me receded slightly, and the strange sensory distortions, the too loud sounds, the too bright colors, faded to normal levels. "Sleep now, Catherine," he said, his voice gentler than it had been all day. He helped me out of my wedding dress and into my nightgown with clinical efficiency, avoiding any hint of the intimacy one might expect between newlyweds on their wedding night. "Everything will be different in the morning." I wanted to ask what he meant, to question the strangeness of his behavior, but exhaustion claimed me before I could form the words. I slept deeply that night, without dreams, the first dreamless sleep I had experienced in weeks. When I woke the next morning, Edward was gone from our bed. Sunlight streamed through the curtains we had not closed the night before, illuminating a room that seemed both familiar and strange. The furniture we had selected together over the past months arranged just as we had planned, yet somehow not quite as I remembered it. I rose, still wearing my wedding nightgown of white silk and lace, and made my way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and toast. I found him in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, as if he had done so all his life. He smiled when he saw me, but something in his expression seemed forced. "Good morning, Mrs. Stone," he said, handing me a cup of tea. "How did you sleep?" "Well enough," I replied, noticing the ring box open beside my teacup. "Should I wear my ring now?" A shadow crossed his face. "Of course. It should never leave your finger now that we are married." He watched intently as I slipped the ring onto my finger. Again, I felt that strange dizziness, a momentary disorientation. Edward studied my face closely. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice tight with some emotion I couldn't identify. "A little lightheaded," I admitted. "Perhaps I should eat something." He nodded, seeming relieved. "Yes, you must keep up your strength. We have a busy day ahead." But we didn't have a busy day. Despite his words, Edward insisted I rest, bringing me books and tea in the parlor, hovering near me like a nurse with an invalid. When I suggested we visit my parents to thank them for the wedding or walk into town to show my new status as Mrs. Stone to our neighbors, he discouraged it, saying we should enjoy our privacy during these first days of marriage. "There will be plenty of time for social calls later," he said, his tone gentle but brooking no argument. "For now, let's savor this time together, just the two of us." I acquiesced, assuming his behavior stemmed from a desire to be alone with his new bride. But as days passed, his reluctance to let me leave our home became more pronounced. He began to work from home, sending messages to the bank rather than going in person. He ordered our groceries delivered rather than allowing me to shop at the market as I had planned. When I mentioned visiting my friend Clara, who lives just 3 streets away, he found reasons why today was not convenient. The weather looked threatening. Clara might be busy with her children. I seemed tired and should rest instead. At first, I did not recognize these actions for what they were: restrictions on my freedom, isolation from my family and friends. I told myself Edward was being protective, concerned for my well-being, eager to establish our household routines before integrating with broader society. It was only gradually that I came to understand the methodical way he was cutting me off from everyone but himself. And always, he insisted I wear the ring. If he noticed me without it, even for such innocent reasons as washing dishes or bathing, he would immediately retrieve it and watch as I put it back on. Each time, that same dizziness would overtake me, that same heightening of sensory input, followed by a subtle clouding of my thoughts. 5 days after our wedding, I awoke in the night to find Edward sitting beside our bed, watching me sleep. The curtains were open, and moonlight illuminated his face. He was staring at my hand, at the ring on my finger, with an expression of such conflict and fear that I felt a chill run through me. "Edward," I whispered, my voice sounding strange in the midnight quiet. "What's wrong?" He startled, clearly not having realized I was awake. His shoulders tensed, then forcibly relaxed as he composed his features into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing, my dear. I couldn't sleep and was just making sure you were comfortable." "You were looking at my ring," I said, raising my hand between us. The opal seemed to glow in the moonlight, shifting colors visible even in the darkness. Blues and greens swirling beneath its glossy surface, like creatures moving in the depths of a midnight sea. Edward captured my hand in his grip uncomfortably tight, his fingers cold against my skin. "It's a beautiful ring. I want to be sure it's keeping you safe." "Safe from what?" I asked, a cold dread spreading through me at his words. He released my hand abruptly, as if it had burned him. "From any harm. That's a husband's duty, isn't it? To protect his wife from the dangers of the world." He rose from his seat beside the bed. "Now go back to sleep, Catherine. Dawn will be here soon." He returned to his side of the bed, but I don't believe he slept. I felt his attention on me for hours afterward, a palpable weight in the darkness, until I finally fell into an uneasy slumber filled with fractured dreams. A woman's voice calling my name from a great distance, water closing over my head, the sensation of drowning while unseen hands held me under. The next morning, I resolved to confront him about his strange behavior, to demand explanations for his secretiveness and the oppressive watchfulness that had characterized our first days of marriage. But when I went downstairs after dressing, I found him speaking with Mr. Drake, the jeweler who had crafted our rings. They sat in the parlor, heads close together in intense conversation, a pot of tea untouched on the table between them. They fell silent when I entered the room, both men staring at me with an intensity that made me step back involuntarily. "Good morning, Mrs. Stone," Mr. Drake said, his pale eyes fixed on my ring. There was something predatory in his gaze, a calculation that made me instinctively fold my hands together, hiding the opal from his view. "Your husband was just telling me how well you're settling into married life." "Was he?" I replied, looking to Edward for explanation. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could see tension in the set of his jaw, in the way his fingers gripped the arm of his chair. "Mr. Drake was passing by and thought to check that your ring fits properly," Edward said smoothly, his tone suggesting this was the most natural thing in the world, though I had never heard of a jeweler making house calls to verify the fit of his creations. "It's a valuable piece, and he wants to ensure his craftsmanship is holding up." I knew this was a lie, knew it with a certainty that surprised me. Their conversation had been too intense, too secretive to be about something as mundane as the fit of a ring. But before I could challenge the explanation, Mr. Drake rose and approached me, taking my hand without permission or preamble. He examined the ring, turning my hand this way and that in the light from the window. His touch was clinical but somehow invasive, his fingers cold and dry against my skin. I fought the urge to pull away, to flee from his uncomfortable scrutiny. "Magnificent," he murmured, speaking more to himself than to either of us. "The binding is perfect. You can see how the colors respond to her." "To me?" I asked, trying once more to pull my hand away, but his grip was surprisingly strong for a man of his apparent age and slight build. Edward stepped forward, a flash of something like anger crossing his face. "That's enough, Drake. You can see it's working as intended." Mr. Drake released my hand reluctantly, his pale eyes still fixed on the opal rather than my face. "Indeed, a most successful joining." He turned to Edward, his manner suddenly brisk and businesslike. "Remember our agreement, Mr. Stone. The ring must remain in place. Removal, even temporarily, could have unfortunate consequences at this stage." He gathered his hat and coat, nodding to me with a formality that bordered on mockery before taking his leave. Edward showed him to the door, their voices too low for me to hear as they exchanged final words on the porch. When Edward returned, his face was set in lines of determination, as if he had come to some difficult decision. I waited until the door was firmly closed behind Mr. Drake before confronting my husband. "What was that about, Edward? What agreement do you have with that man? And why am I not to remove my ring?" Edward paced the parlor for several moments, clearly struggling with himself. Finally, he stopped before me, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "Catherine, do you trust me?" The question took me aback. A week ago, I would have answered without hesitation. Now, faced with his strange behavior, his secretiveness, the clear evidence that he was hiding something significant from me, I hesitated. "I'm not sure anymore," I answered truthfully, forcing myself to meet his gaze despite the hurt that flashed across his face at my words. "You've been behaving strangely since our wedding. You're keeping secrets from me. This isn't how I imagined beginning our marriage." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "I had hoped to protect you from this knowledge, but perhaps that was a mistake." He led me to the sofa and sat beside me, still holding my hands. "What I tell you now will sound impossible, perhaps even mad, but I swear it is the truth." He told me a story so fantastic I would have laughed had he not been so gravely serious, had I not already witnessed enough strangeness to make me doubt the rational world I thought I knew. According to Edward, the opal in my ring was no ordinary stone. It had been in the Drake family for generations, passed down through a line of jewelers who understood its unique properties. The stone could bind a spirit, a displaced soul, to the living. Edward's colleague, James Holloway, had introduced him to Drake months ago, at a time when James was experiencing what he described as unexplainable disturbances in his home. James's sister, Eleanor Holloway, had died suddenly in February. Consumption, the doctors said, though her decline had been unusually rapid. She had been a healthy, vibrant young woman of 24, engaged to be married in the spring, when she began experiencing strange symptoms that baffled her physicians. It wasn't merely physical deterioration, but changes in her personality, her habits, even her voice that alarmed her family. In her final days, she spoke of strange dreams and sensations of being followed by an unseen presence. After her death, James became convinced that whatever had haunted his sister had not departed with her death. He experienced cold spots in his home, objects moved without explanation, and glimpsed a woman's figure in mirrors and windows, a woman who was not his sister, but someone unknown to him, older and with a malevolent aspect that filled him with dread. James was desperate, Edward explained, his voice dropping to almost a whisper though we were alone in the house. He consulted doctors, clergymen, even a medium from Boston, but the disturbances only increased. He couldn't sleep, couldn't work. He was on the verge of abandoning his home altogether when a colleague at the bank mentioned Mr. Drake. Desperate, James sought help from the jeweler, who claimed his family had dealt with such supernatural phenomena for generations. Drake confirmed James's suspicions. A restless spirit had attached itself to Eleanor and remained active after her death, seeking another host. A ghost? I asked incredulously. You expect me to believe in ghosts? Edward shook his head. Not a ghost exactly. Drake described it as a displaced soul, a spirit that refused to pass on after death and instead seeks to return to the physical world by attaching itself to the living. According to Drake, such entities can only manifest physically by possessing a living host, but they can cause disturbances in the environment even without a body. Drake offered a solution: the binding stone. The opal could capture the entity and bind it safely, but the process required a living host to wear the stone. The spirit would be contained within the opal, unable to affect the wearer or anyone else, so long as the ring remained on the host's finger. James had asked Edward, as his closest friend, to find someone who could wear the ring, someone who would keep it safe and never remove it. So you married me to make me the keeper of this spirit? I asked, pulling my hands from his grasp, revulsion and anger rising within me. Our entire courtship, our engagement, was it all a sham designed to find a vessel for this supernatural prisoner? Edward's face crumpled, genuine distress evident in every line of his features. No. God, no, Catherine. I've loved you since the moment we met at the autumn dance 3 years ago. I always intended to ask for your hand. I had already purchased an engagement ring from Harris & Sons when James came to me with this problem. His eyes pleaded with me to understand. But when this situation arose, I saw a way to help my friend and begin our life together. The timing seemed providential. Providential? I repeated, my voice rising. You've made me an unwitting jailer to some malevolent entity, and you call it providential? You had no right to make this decision for me, Edward. No right at all. You should have told me, I continued, staring at the ring on my finger with new horror. I wanted to tear it off, to fling it across the room, but fear of what might happen stayed my hand. You should have explained all this before our wedding, before I bound my life to yours with vows that now seem built on deception. Would you have believed me? He asked, his voice low and intense. If I had come to you with this tale of displaced spirits and binding stones, would you have accepted it as truth, or would you have thought me mad, perhaps broken our engagement entirely? I had no answer. The story was too fantastic, too removed from everything I understood about the world. Yet it explained Edward's strange behavior, his insistence that I never remove the ring, his constant vigilance, and the odd conversation I had overheard between him and my father. It even explained the dream I had experienced before the wedding, the face in the opal trying to warn me of what was to come. What happens if I take it off? I asked, twisting the ring on my finger, feeling its now familiar weight. Edward's expression darkened. Drake wasn't entirely clear on that point. He said only that the binding is new and fragile. If the ring is removed too soon, the spirit could escape its confines. It would seek a new host immediately, and that would be me, since I've been wearing it. Edward nodded grimly. Drake believes the spirit would attempt to possess you fully, rather than remaining contained in the stone. Without the barrier of the opal between you, it could overwhelm your consciousness entirely. And after some time, will the binding strengthen? Drake believes so. In a year, perhaps 2, the spirit will be permanently bound to the stone. Then the ring could be stored safely away, never to be worn again. Edward leaned forward, taking my hands once more. It's why I've been so protective, so insistent about the ring. I know it must have seemed strange to you, perhaps even controlling, but I was trying to keep you safe. I looked down at my hand, at the beautiful opal that now seemed sinister in its perfection. The colors swirled beneath its surface as if alive, as if watching our conversation with malevolent interest. You should have told me, I repeated, unable to fully process the magnitude of what Edward had revealed. Edward knelt before me, taking my hands once more. I know, I was wrong to keep this from you, but I swear, Catherine, I will keep you safe. We'll endure this time together, and then put it behind us. Our life together is just beginning. His eyes, those hazel eyes I had loved for 3 years, shone with earnest sincerity. Please forgive me. I thought I was protecting you. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think the man I loved had made a terrible mistake, but still had my best interests at heart. Yet doubt had taken root in my mind. growing alongside a new and uncomfortable awareness of the ring on my finger. Could I truly feel the presence within it, or was it merely suggestion after Edward's fantastic tale? "I need time," I said finally. "Time to think about all of this, to decide if I can forgive such a breach of trust at the very foundation of our marriage." Edward nodded, relief visible in the softening of his expression. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Just promise me one thing. Don't remove the ring. Whatever your feelings toward me, please keep it on, for your safety and for the safety of others." I promised, though the pledge felt like shackles closing around me. What choice did I have? If Edward's tale was true, removing the ring could unleash something dangerous, not just on me, but potentially on others. If it was false, if this elaborate story was merely a bizarre fabrication, well, keeping a ring on my finger seemed a small concession while I determined the truth. That night, after Edward had fallen asleep, I slipped from our bed and went to the bathroom mirror. In the moonlight streaming through the small window, I studied the ring on my finger. The opal seemed to pulse with an inner light, colors shifting beneath its dark surface in patterns too deliberate to be random. I twisted it on my finger, feeling an irrational reluctance to touch the stone directly, as if it might burn or contaminate me. "Who are you?" I whispered, bringing the ring closer to my face, studying it in the dim light. "What do you want?" For a moment, just a heartbeat, I saw it clearly, a woman's face forming in the depths of the stone. Not Eleanor Holloway, whom I had met once at a bank function before her illness, and found to be sweet-natured and somewhat shy, but someone else, someone with eyes full of malice and a mouth curved in a smile that made my blood run cold. The face was the same as in my dream before the wedding, now made terrifyingly real. Then the image was gone, and I was left staring at a beautiful but ordinary opal. Had I imagined it? Had Edward's story planted the suggestion in my mind, causing me to see patterns where none existed? Or had the entity truly revealed itself to me, perhaps sensing my new awareness of its presence? I have worn the ring for 2 weeks now. Each day I feel a little less like myself. There are moments when I find myself in rooms with no memory of how I got there. Times when I catch sight of my reflection and don't immediately recognize the woman staring back at me. My voice sometimes sounds strange to my own ears, the cadence and tone subtly altered. The words I speak occasionally surprise me, as if someone else had selected them. Edward watches me constantly, his expression alternating between hope and fear. Sometimes I catch him studying me as if searching for signs of something or someone other than his wife. He speaks to me carefully, as if addressing a potentially dangerous stranger rather than the woman he married. At night, he often pretends to sleep while actually keeping vigil, his breathing never settling into the deep rhythm of true slumber. Yesterday, I found myself standing in the kitchen, a knife in my hand, with no recollection of having picked it up. I was simply there, suddenly aware, the sharp blade gleaming in the afternoon light. I had been preparing vegetables for dinner, I thought, yet the cutting board was bare, the vegetables still in their basket untouched. Edward found me there, staring at the blade. The look of terror on his face haunts me still. He approached me cautiously, speaking in a soothing tone, as one might address a wild animal, and gently pried the knife from my fingers. I let him take it, confused by his reaction and by my own lapse in memory. "Are you all right, Catherine?" he asked, setting the knife well out of reach. "Of course," I replied, but even to my own ears my voice sounded wrong, slightly deeper, with an inflection I didn't recognize. Why wouldn't I be? Edward studied my face for a long moment before answering. "You seemed distant, as if you were somewhere else entirely." "I was just thinking about dinner," I lied, unsettled by the gap in my memory and by Edward's obvious fear. "You startled me, that's all." He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. But he nodded and suggested we dine out instead. Another unprecedented event in our short marriage. Until then, he had insisted we take all our meals at home. I must find a way to end this. If what Edward and Drake believe is true, I cannot continue as the unwitting jailer of some malevolent spirit. If they are mistaken, if this is all some elaborate deception or delusion, I need to discover the truth. Either way, I cannot go on as I am, slowly losing myself day by day. I plan to visit James Holloway tomorrow while Edward is meeting with clients. Perhaps he can provide answers Edward has withheld. Perhaps he knows more about the entity in the ring, or about Drake and his binding stones. For now, I keep the ring on my finger, not for Edward's sake, but because a part of me fears what might happen if I remove it. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep claims me, I feel her, the woman in the opal, testing the boundaries of her prison, waiting for me to lower my guard, watching, always watching. God help me, I think she's growing stronger. Eleanor stares at the final words of the entry, a chill running down her spine despite the warmth of her apartment. Catherine's descent into fear and paranoia is palpable in her increasingly desperate words. The handwriting itself tells a story, becoming more hurried and less controlled as the entry progresses, the elegant penmanship of a well-educated young woman giving way to something more frantic, more disturbed. She checks the time, nearly midnight. She has been reading for hours, completely absorbed in Catherine's story. Outside her windows, the city has grown quiet, most of its inhabitants asleep while she sits alone with the century-old fears of a woman long dead. Eleanor shivers, suddenly aware of the silence of her apartment, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional passing car on the street below. June 29th, 1908. I have so little time. Edward will return soon, and he must not know I've written this. I visited James Holloway as planned. His house on the north side of town is grand but feels empty, unlived in. James himself looks ill, thin and pale, with the same haunted expression I've begun to notice in Edward's eyes. He was reluctant to speak with me at first, claiming he had an appointment. But when I showed him my ring and demanded to know the truth about his sister, the blood drained from his face. He was reluctant to speak with me at first, claiming he had an appointment that could not be delayed. His hands shook as he attempted to close the door, but I placed my foot in the gap, a boldness that would have shocked me mere weeks ago. "Please, Mr. Holloway," I said, lowering my voice though there was no one to overhear us on the quiet street. "I know about the binding stone. I know about the spirit. I need to understand what's happening to me." The blood drained from his face at my words. "Edward told you," he said, not a question, but a statement of fact, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some of it," I replied, holding his gaze steadily. "I want to hear your version. I believe I'm entitled to the full truth, given that I'm the one wearing this ring." He hesitated, glancing nervously up and down the street as if expecting to see Edward approaching, before reluctantly stepping aside to allow me entry. 20 minutes, he said, checking his pocket watch. "That's all I can spare. I do have an appointment, though not for another hour." He invited me inside then, leading me to a sitting room where heavy curtains blocked most of the daylight, leaving the room in a gloomy half-light that seemed fitting for our conversation. Photographs of his sister Eleanor were prominently displayed on the mantel and side tables, a pretty young woman with light hair and a serious expression. In the largest portrait, she wore a high-necked white blouse with a cameo at her throat, her hair arranged in the Gibson girl style that had been popular a few years ago. She looked nothing like the face I had glimpsed in the opal. James confirmed much of what Edward had told me, though his version contained details Edward had omitted. His sister had not simply died of consumption, as the official story claimed. In the weeks before her death, she had changed dramatically. Her personality, her habits, even the way she spoke. The doctors called it delirium from fever, but James believed something had taken possession of her. "It started with small things," he said, pacing the room as he spoke, unable to sit still. "She began using her left hand, though she had always been right-handed. Her handwriting changed. She developed tastes for foods she had previously disliked, suddenly craving rare meat when she had always preferred it well done, drinking strong black coffee when she had never taken coffee at all. After her death, the strange occurrences in his home began immediately. At first, small things, objects moved or missing, cold spots, the sense of being watched. Then more disturbing incidents, words scratched into the walls, the smell of decay in rooms that had been freshly cleaned, glimpses of a woman who was not Eleanor, older, with dark hair and eyes that reflected no light. I knew then it wasn't Eleanor haunting the house, James told me, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever had taken her over had remained after she died, looking for a new host. He found Drake through rumors and whispers. The jeweler's family had a reputation among certain circles for dealing with matters beyond normal understanding. Drake confirmed James's fears and offered the binding solution. "The stone has been in his family for generations," James explained. "He said it once belonged to a powerful medium who used it to communicate with spirits. After her death, it was discovered the opal had absorbed her abilities, allowing it to capture and contain spiritual entities." "And you agreed to this plan?" I asked. "To bind this thing to a ring and trick someone into wearing it?" James looked away, shame evident in his posture. I was desperate. It was growing stronger in my house, more malevolent. Drake said if it wasn't contained, it would eventually find another living person to possess. Someone vulnerable, a child perhaps. So you and Edward decided I should be the one to contain it. It wasn't like that, James insisted. Edward truly loves you. He believed he could protect you. Drake assured us you would never be in danger as long as you wore the ring. The spirit would be trapped in the opal, unable to influence you. Drake was wrong, I said quietly. I feel her. Every day she grows stronger. James's face paled further. What do you mean? I told him about my lost time, the strange impulses, the moments when I didn't recognize myself. With each detail, his expression grew more horrified. This shouldn't be happening, he said. Drake promised the binding would be complete. The spirit would be contained. Then Drake lied, I replied. Or he didn't understand the power of what he was dealing with. James paced the room, running his hands through his hair in agitation. We need to speak with him immediately. If the binding is failing. What was her name? I interrupted. James stopped pacing. Whose name? The woman. The entity. She had to come from somewhere. Be someone. My voice was steady, though inside I trembled with a mixture of fear and a strange, almost morbid curiosity. She has a face, a presence. She must have a name. James hesitated before answering, as if reluctant to give substance to the entity by naming it. Drake had a theory. After I described what I was seeing in my home, he researched local history. He believes it may be a woman named Victoria Blackwood. The name sent a chill through me, though I had never heard it before. Or had I? For a moment it seemed familiar, as if I had known it all my life but somehow forgotten until this moment. I felt a stirring within me, a ripple of something like recognition or awareness that was not my own. Who was she? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now. According to Drake's research, she lived in Millfield in the 1870s. She was different, a woman who lived alone on the edge of town, who gathered herbs and made remedies. Some called her a healer, others a witch. James couldn't meet my eyes as he continued. She was accused of causing illness in several children after a dispute with their father over a debt. A mob formed, not an official action by the town authorities, but a group of men who took matters into their own hands. They dragged her from her home one night and... He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the gruesome details. And what? I pressed, needing to hear it all. They drowned her in Miller's Pond on the edge of town. James finished quietly. Drake believes her spirit has lingered, filled with rage, seeking revenge on the town that killed her, on the descendants of those who participated in her murder or stood by and allowed it to happen. I felt sick as the pieces fell into place. And now she's bound to me, I whispered, twisting the ring on my finger. The metal felt suddenly hot against my skin, though I knew it was likely my imagination, my mind responding to the horror of what I had learned. To me, whose family has been in Millfield for generations, whose great-grandfather was the town mayor in the 1870s. James looked up sharply at this. Mayor Jonathan Sullivan? He was your great-grandfather? I nodded, a leaden weight settling in my stomach. Yes, Father speaks of him often, of his leadership during Millfield's period of greatest growth. James's expression shifted to one of grave concern. Drake didn't know of your connection to the former mayor. Neither did Edward, I'm certain. This complicates matters. Complicates them how? I demanded, though I feared I already knew the answer. If Victoria Blackwood seeks revenge on those she believes wronged her, and your ancestor was the town's leader during the period of her death, she would see me as a prime target. I finished for him. The descendant of a man who, by virtue of his position, if nothing else, bears some responsibility for her fate. James nodded grimly. It may explain why the binding is failing. Drake said the stone creates a neutral vessel. But if there is a direct connection between you and her, she might have a stronger claim on me, I said, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. A reason to fight harder for control. We went immediately to Drake's shop, cutting through back streets to avoid being seen by anyone who might report my movements to Edward. But the small storefront was closed and shuttered, with no sign of the jeweler. A neighboring shopkeeper sweeping the sidewalk outside his tobacco store told us Drake had left town suddenly 2 days earlier, leaving no forwarding address or indication of when or if he might return. James was distraught, pacing before the shuttered shop in agitation. This can't be happening. He promised the binding would hold. He took our money, a considerable sum, and assured us the matter was resolved. I felt surprisingly calm, considering the circumstances. Something inside me had expected this betrayal, had known Drake would not be there when we sought answers. Had he known all along that the binding would fail? Had he deliberately selected me as the vessel, knowing my connection to Mayor Sullivan? Or had he simply seized an opportunity when Edward approached him, taking his money and providing a temporary solution, while planning his own escape before the inevitable failure became apparent? "What do we do now?" James asked, more to himself than to me, his face a mask of desperation. "Without Drake's expertise, I need to remove the ring," I said decisively. James grabbed my wrist, his grip painfully tight. "No, if you remove it, she'll be free again. She could possess you completely, or worse, move on to someone else. We have no idea what would happen." "She's already possessing me," I countered, pulling my arm from his grasp. "Each day I lose more of myself to her. The ring isn't containing her, it's giving her direct access to me." We argued in the street, drawing curious glances from passers-by. A gentleman tipped his hat as he passed, his eyes lingering on us with the avid interest of someone who sensed potential scandal. I recognized him vaguely as one of Father's business associates, and realized with sudden clarity how this scene must appear. A newly married woman engaged in a heated discussion with a man not her husband, outside a shop in an area of town respectable ladies rarely frequented. "We should not continue this conversation here," I said, lowering my voice. "We're attracting attention." James nodded, visibly trying to compose himself. "You're right, but please, Mrs. Stone, promise me you won't remove the ring until we've exhausted all other options. There must be someone else who can help us, someone with knowledge of such matters." After a moment's consideration, his expression brightened slightly. "Dr. Elias Winters," he said. "He's a retired professor from Harvard who now lives just outside of town. He studied unusual phenomena, what he calls the intersection of the physical and metaphysical realms. People around here think him eccentric, but he's a genuine scholar. If anyone in Millfield might have knowledge that could help us, it would be him." With few other options, I agreed to accompany James to Dr. Winters' home. We hired a hansom cab rather than using James's carriage, both of us conscious of the need for discretion. The cab driver raised his eyebrows at our destination, a remote house some 2 miles outside of town, but made no comment beyond naming his price. Dr. Winters lived outside town in a sprawling Victorian house, surrounded by gardens that seemed to blend cultivated flowers with wild growth in a manner both chaotic and somehow deliberate. The house itself stood 3 stories tall, with a circular tower at one corner and a broad wraparound porch laden with potted plants and curious instruments that might have been weather gauges, or perhaps something more esoteric. He was older than I expected, with a shock of white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He answered the door himself, wearing a smoking jacket over a waistcoat despite the summer heat, as if he had stepped directly from a London gentleman's club into the Massachusetts countryside. He showed no surprise at our unannounced arrival, merely nodding as if he had been expecting visitors. "Mr. Holloway," he greeted James, then turned to me with a slight bow. "And you must be Mrs. Stone. I've heard of your recent nuptials. Please come in." He led us through a house that seemed both scholarly and slightly otherworldly. Rooms lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, tables covered with scientific instruments alongside objects that appeared decidedly less conventional, crystal spheres, oddly shaped stones, jars containing substances I could not identify. The air smelled of pipe tobacco, old books, and something herbal that reminded me vaguely of Mr. Drake's shop. We settled in what appeared to be his study, where a large desk stood before bay windows overlooking the garden. Dr. Winters listened to our story without interruption, his expression growing graver with each detail. When James mentioned Victoria Blackwood, the old professor's eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment until we had finished our account. When we finished, he asked to examine my ring. I extended my hand, and he studied the opal carefully, though he did not touch it. He produced a jeweler's loupe from his desk drawer and peered at the stone with professional intensity, his breath creating small clouds on its polished surface. "This is old magic," he said finally, setting aside the loupe and leaning back in his chair. "Dangerous and unpredictable. The stone is indeed a binding agent, but not in the way your jeweler described it." He rose and retrieved a large leather-bound book from a nearby shelf. The volume looked ancient, its binding cracked with age. its pages yellowed and fragile as he carefully opened it to a marked page. He showed us an illustration of a ring remarkably similar to mine, a dark oval stone set in an intricate gold band. The drawing was accompanied by text in a language I did not recognize, with annotations in English in a more modern hand. "The binding stone," he read from the text beside the illustration, his finger tracing the words. "Used by practitioners to forge connections between the living and the dead, not to contain spirits, but to create a bridge between worlds." "A bridge?" James repeated, the color draining from his face. "Not a prison?" Dr. Winters nodded solemnly. "The stone doesn't imprison the spirit. It creates a channel through which the spirit can gradually merge with the living host. Over time, the two become one, the living body housing two souls, with the stronger eventually dominating." I felt faint at his words, understanding at last what I had been experiencing. The lapses in memory, the unfamiliar reflections, the moments when my voice or thoughts seemed not my own, all signs of this merging process. "She's not trying to escape the stone," I whispered. "She's trying to escape into me." "Yes," Dr. Winters confirmed, closing the book carefully. "And from what you've described, she's already making significant progress. The lapses in memory, the unfamiliar reflections, these are moments when Victoria's consciousness is ascendant over your own." "How do we stop it?" James demanded, rising from his chair in agitation. "How do we separate them before it's too late?" Dr. Winters returned the book to its shelf before answering, his movements deliberate, as if buying time to consider his words carefully. "The process can be reversed, but only in its early stages. The ring must be removed and properly cleansed. Then it must be destroyed to break the connection permanently." "And if it's too late?" I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know the truth. "If the merging has progressed too far?" Dr. Winters met my gaze directly. "If the merging progresses too far, removing the ring won't help. The spirit will remain connected to you, with or without the physical conduit." "How do we know if it's too late?" James asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "There is a test," Dr. Winters replied. He left the room briefly, returning with a small mirror in an ornate silver frame. The mirror's surface appeared unusual, darker than a normal-looking glass, with a slightly rippled appearance, as if the silver backing had been damaged by water or time. "This is a spirit glass," he explained, holding it carefully by its frame. "It reveals what lies beneath the surface, what is hidden from ordinary sight." My heart pounded as he held the mirror before me. For a moment I saw only my own reflection, pale and frightened, my hair coming loose from its pins, my eyes wide with dread. Then the image shifted, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Another face superimposed over mine, older with sharp features and dark, burning eyes. A cruel smile curved lips that were not mine, an expression of such malice that I recoiled with a cry of alarm. Dr. Winters lowered the mirror, his expression grim. "The merging has begun," he said, "but it is not complete. There is still time, though not much." "What must we do?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Whatever happened, I would not surrender to Victoria Blackwood without a fight. If there was a chance to free myself from her influence, I would take it, regardless of the risk. Dr. Winters set the mirror carefully on his desk before answering. "We must perform a ritual to cleanse the ring and break the connection. It requires specific materials: blessed water from St. Michael's Church, salt from the Dead Sea, sage burned at midnight, and most crucially, something that belonged to Victoria Blackwood in life." "That's impossible," James protested, throwing up his hands in frustration. "She died more than 30 years ago. How could we possibly find something that belonged to her?" Dr. Winters smiled sadly. "That is the challenge with such matters. Without something to draw her spirit back to its origin point, to anchor it to its own past rather than your present, Mrs. Stone, the connection cannot be fully severed. There must be another way," I insisted. "Some substitute, some alternative method." Dr. Winters considered this. "The ritual would be weaker, less certain of success, but it might be possible to use something connected to the place of her death rather than a personal possession. Water from Miller's Pond, perhaps, or soil from the shore where she died. The physical location may retain enough of her essence to serve as an anchor point." We left with instructions for the ritual, a small pouch of Dead Sea salt that Dr. Winters provided from his own supplies, and directions to gather the remaining materials ourselves. James insisted on accompanying me home, worried about leaving me alone in my increasingly vulnerable state. It was well past my appointed hour for return, and I feared Edward would already be searching for me. Indeed, as our hired cab approached Elm Street, I saw Edward pacing before our house, his figure tense with anxiety even from a distance. James instructed the driver to continue past my home and let us out around the corner, out of Edward's sight. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "I've been worried sick." Before I could answer, James stepped forward. "The binding is failing, Edward. Catherine is in danger." Edward's face drained of color. "What are you talking about?" "Winters," Edward repeated, his expression darkening. "That old fraud? Catherine, you can't possibly believe anything that man says. He's been discredited by every serious scientific institution in the country. His theories on spiritual manifestations were laughed out of Harvard 20 years ago. He knew about the binding stone," I countered. "He showed us an illustration of a ring almost identical to mine in a book that appeared far older than his disgrace at Harvard. And he had a mirror, a spirit glass, he called it, that showed Victoria's face superimposed over mine." Edward began to respond, but a knock at the door interrupted him. "James, right on schedule." Edward's expression hardened when he opened the door to find his friend on our porch, but he stepped aside to allow him entry. "I should have known you'd be behind this," Edward said, his voice cold as he closed the door. "Was it your idea to seek out Winters? To fill my wife's head with even more frightening nonsense?" "It's not nonsense, Edward," James replied evenly. "The binding is failing. Catherine is in danger. She's experiencing symptoms that Drake never warned us about. Lost time, personality changes, lapses in memory. The spirit is merging with her, not simply contained in the stone as Drake promised." Edward shook his head violently. "No, Drake was clear. Removing the ring would free the spirit completely. It could fully possess Catherine or escape to harm others. The binding must be maintained." "Drake lied," I said firmly, stepping between the two men. "Or was mistaken. The ring isn't a prison. It's a gateway. She's using it to take control of me." Edward looked torn, his love for me warring with his fear of the unknown. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that reminded me powerfully of James's similar habit. These two men, so different in many ways, united in their guilt over what they had unwittingly done to me. "Tell him what Winters said," James urged. "Tell him about the ritual." I explained Dr. Winters' instructions, including the seemingly impossible requirement of finding something that had belonged to Victoria Blackwood. Edward listened intently, his initial skepticism gradually giving way to thoughtful consideration. To my surprise, his expression changed from despair to something almost like hope. "There might be a way," he said slowly. "The Historical Society has artifacts from that period, and Miller's Pond, where she was drowned. Local children sometimes find old objects along its shores when the water level drops in late summer. We don't have time for a scavenger hunt," James argued. "Dr. Winters said the merging accelerates as it progresses. Catherine could have days, not weeks." "Then we'll start immediately," Edward said, a new determination in his voice. "I'll go to the Historical Society tonight. James, you check with anyone who might remember stories about Victoria Blackwood. There must be someone in town old enough to recall the events, even as a child." They continued discussing possibilities, united now in purpose despite their earlier conflict. I should have felt relief at their cooperation, at the prospect of a solution to my plight. Instead, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing the scene from a distance. Their voices seemed to come from far away, and a curious buzzing filled my ears, drowning out their words. Something was happening to me, something I couldn't control. I felt a presence stirring within me, a consciousness separate from my own, growing stronger by the minute. Was it because we had spoken Victoria's name? Because we had declared our intention to break her hold on me? Whatever the reason, she was fighting back, asserting her will against mine with greater force than ever before. I tried to speak, to warn Edward and James, but my lips wouldn't move. I was a prisoner in my own body, able to observe but not to act. I watched as my hand, no longer under my control, reached for a heavy crystal paperweight on the side table. My fingers closed around it, lifting it with purpose. Neither man noticed my silent struggle, both still focused on their plans to save me. Edward was saying something about an elderly librarian who might have access to town records from the 1870s when my arm rose of its own accord, the paperweight clutched tightly in my hand. I screamed inside my mind, fighting desperately for control of my own body. But Victoria was too strong. I was merely a spectator as my arm swung forward with vicious force, striking James on the back of the head. He crumpled to the floor without a sound, blood immediately staining the carpet beneath him. Edward turned in shock, his expression changing from surprise to horror as he took in the scene. James unconscious or worse on the floor, me standing over him with the bloodied paperweight still in my hand. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My God, what have you done?" My lips curved into a smile that wasn't mine. When I spoke, the voice that emerged was not my own, deeper, harsher, with a cadence that belonged to another time. "Catherine isn't here right now," the voice said, using my mouth, my tongue, my breath. "But Victoria would be pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Stone. After all, we are family now, are we not?" Edward backed away, his face ashen. "Fight her, Catherine. You must fight her." My body laughed, a sound that held no mirth, only malice. "Your wife is weak. She surrendered so easily, with barely a struggle." Perhaps she wanted this, to relinquish control, to let someone stronger take the reins. "I don't believe you," Edward said, his eyes darting to James's motionless form, then to the door, clearly calculating his chances of reaching help. "Catherine would never surrender. Not to you. Believe what you wish," my voice replied. "It changes nothing. By midnight, there will be nothing left of Catherine Sullivan Stone. Only Victoria Blackwood, returned to flesh after 30 years of waiting." Edward lunged suddenly, not for the door, but for me. He grabbed my wrists, pinning my arms to prevent another attack. "Catherine, listen to me. You're stronger than she is. You can fight this." For a moment, just a fleeting instant, I felt control returning. "Edward," I gasped, my true voice breaking through. "The ring. Take it off. Now, while I can." But Victoria surged back, stronger than before. My body convulsed, fighting against Edward's restraining grip with inhuman strength. I watched in horror as my knee drove upward into his stomach, causing him to double over in pain. My hands, now free, shoved him backward with such force that he stumbled and fell, striking his head against the fireplace mantel with a sickening crack. He slumped to the floor, a trail of blood marking his descent down the polished wood of the mantel. His eyes remained open, staring at me with an expression of shocked betrayal that would haunt me forever, if there was to be a forever for Catherine Stone. I fought with every ounce of my remaining strength, struggling to regain control of my limbs, my voice, anything that would allow me to help Edward and James. But Victoria's will was implacable, her hatred and rage fueling a strength that my own depleted resources couldn't match. I was being pushed deeper into the recesses of my own mind, my awareness dimming like a candle, guttering in a strong wind. My body moved to stand over Edward, looking down at his still form with satisfaction. My hand reached out, not to help him, but to check his pocket watch. 8:30, hours yet until midnight, when Victoria believed her dominance would be complete. I was fading, my grip on consciousness weakening. In a final, desperate effort, I directed all my remaining will toward my right hand, the hand wearing the opal ring. If I could only remove it, perhaps there was still a chance. Dr. Winters had said the merging wasn't complete. There might still be time. For a heartbeat, I won control of that one hand. My fingers grasped the ring, twisting it, pulling it up over my knuckle. Victoria screamed inside our shared mind, her rage and panic flooding through me as the ring slipped free of my finger. A blast of sensation overwhelmed me, light and sound and pain beyond description. I felt as if I were being torn apart from within, two souls fighting for dominance of a single vessel. Then darkness claimed me, and I knew nothing more. July 3rd, 1908. They think they've won. Fools. They found a weathered leather pouch at the bottom of Miller's Pond, one of my herb bags, preserved somehow in the silt all these years. With this personal item, they performed their pathetic ritual last night under the new moon. Edward held me down, held Catherine down, while James pried the ring from her finger. They dropped it into a bowl of blessed water mixed with salt, reciting the words that old fraud Winters taught them. The opal hissed and steamed in the solution, turning milky white as if drained of color. They believe they've saved her. Catherine has returned to herself, weeping with relief in Edward's arms. She thinks the nightmare is over. They burned the ring in the fireplace afterward, watching until the gold melted and the stone cracked into useless fragments. Such dramatic flair, such complete ignorance of the true nature of what they face. The fools didn't understand. By the time they removed the ring, I had already transferred enough of myself into Catherine. The ring was merely the doorway. Once I had passed through, destroying it meant nothing. The connection was already forged, the bridge already built between her soul and mine. I remain within her, hidden for now. I allow her consciousness to dominate while I gather my strength. They watch her closely for signs of me, but they will see nothing until I choose to reveal myself. Edward has taken a leave of absence from the bank to stay with her constantly. James visits daily, bringing news of his continued research into my death, as if understanding how I died will somehow help them prevent my return to life. Little do they know that with each passing day, with each hour that Catherine sleeps, I grow stronger. I feed on her dreams, on her fears, on the dark corners of her mind that she herself fears to examine. Soon, I will be strong enough to take control again, not temporarily, as before, but permanently. Edward insisted on photographing the ring before they destroyed it. A memento of their victory, he called it. The camera captured what their eyes could not see. My face within the stone, watching, waiting. A record of my presence that will outlive all of them. Millfield will pay for what it did to me. Every family, every bloodline that remained silent while I was dragged to the pond. Their descendants will suffer as I suffered. Starting with Mayor Sullivan's precious great-granddaughter, whose body will serve as the instrument of my revenge. I have waited 30 years for justice. I can wait a little longer. Vipa B. Eleanor closes the journal with shaking hands, a chill running through her despite the warmth of her apartment. The final entry confirms her suspicions about the photograph. The face she had seen in the magnified image of the opal wasn't a trick of light or her imagination. It was Victoria Blackwood, somehow captured by the camera at the moment of her supposed defeat. She retrieves the photograph from her bag, examining it again under her desk lamp. With the magnifying glass, the face in the stone is unmistakable now that she knows to look for it. A woman with sharp features and dark eyes, her expression one of malicious triumph rather than defeat. "My God," Eleanor whispers to the empty room. It was real. She sits back, mind racing with implications. If Catherine's journal is accurate, what happened after that final entry? Did Victoria Blackwood carry out her planned revenge? Were there any unusual incidents in Millfield after July 1908 that might be attributed to the vengeful spirit working through Catherine? Her research instincts kick in despite her unease. This isn't just a creepy story. It's potentially an important piece of local history, a hidden explanation for events that might have shaped Millfield's development. She opens her laptop and begins searching through the Historical Society's digital archives, which include scanned newspapers, police reports, and town records dating back to the town's founding. It takes hours of painstaking work, but gradually a pattern emerges. Beginning in late 1908 and continuing for several years, Millfield experienced a series of tragic events that contemporaries described as a run of terrible luck or a dark cloud over the town. Unexplained deaths, mysterious fires, children falling ill with symptoms doctors couldn't diagnose. The mayor at the time, Catherine's father, Robert Sullivan, resigned his position in December 1908 after the sudden death of his wife, citing grief and an inability to fulfill his duties. Most telling is what happened to the principal figures in Catherine's journal. James Holloway committed suicide in October 1908, leaving a note that simply read, "She was never gone. God forgive me." Dr. Elias Winters disappeared from his home in December of the same year, his house found in perfect order except for a shattered mirror, the spirit glass, on his study floor. The local newspaper reported that foul play is suspected, though no body has been recovered. And Edward and Catherine Stone. According to town records, they moved away from Millfield in early 1909. Destination unknown. A brief notice in the Millfield Gazette mentioned only that Mr. Edward Stone, formerly of the First National Bank, and his wife have relocated to pursue opportunities elsewhere. No further record of them exists in the county archives. Eleanor leans back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. She has been researching all night, and dawn is approaching, the first gray light of day seeping around her curtains. The story is fascinating from a historical perspective, exactly the kind of local mystery that visitors to the Historical Society would find captivating. But something about it troubles her deeply. She looks again at the photograph of the ring, at the face visible in the magnified stone. Then she remembers something. The ring itself had been in Thomas Hayes's donation box. Catherine Sullivan became Catherine Stone, but Thomas's grandmother was Margaret Sullivan, who became Margaret Hayes. A family connection. Eleanor reaches for her phone to call Thomas, then hesitates. It's not even 6 a.m. Too early for such a call. Besides, what would she say? That his great-grandmother's cousin might have been possessed by a vengeful spirit through a cursed opal ring? That the same ring was somehow in his grandmother's possession? That the strange deaths and misfortunes that had plagued Millfield in the early 1900s might have been caused by Victoria Blackwood working through Catherine Stone? She decides to wait until a more reasonable hour. In the meantime, she returns to the journal, rereading key passages and making notes. The story of Catherine, Edward, and Victoria Blackwood is compelling but difficult to verify. Was it genuine or elaborate fiction? A documented haunting, or the product of Catherine's imagination, perhaps influenced by the psychological strains of a new marriage? Around 9 a.m., Eleanor finally calls Thomas Hayes. "Mr. Hayes? This is Eleanor Wright from the Historical Society. I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all," Thomas replies, sounding fully awake. "I'm an early riser. Did you find something interesting in Grand's things?" "Potentially very interesting," Eleanor says carefully, unsure how much to reveal. "Your grandmother's maiden name was Sullivan, correct? Do you know if she was related to a Catherine Sullivan who lived in Millfield in the early 1900s? There's a pause on the line. "Actually, yes. Catherine was my grandmother's cousin. There was some family mystery about her. Gran didn't talk about her much, but when she did, she'd get this strange look on her face. Half sad, half, I don't know, almost afraid." Eleanor's pulse quickens. "Did your grandmother ever mention Catherine's husband, Edward Stone, or what happened to Catherine after she married?" "Not that I recall, but there was something. Wait, I remember now. When I was about 12, I found Gran staring at that ring, the one I brought to you. When I asked about it, she said it had belonged to her cousin Catherine, who had given it to her for safekeeping before disappearing. She made me promise never to wear it or sell it, said it had to stay in the family." "Did she say anything else about Catherine or the ring?" Thomas is quiet for a moment. "Just one thing. She said, 'Some things should stay buried, Tommy. Some secrets are meant to be kept.' I didn't think much of it at the time. Gran could be dramatic sometimes. Is the ring important?" "It might be," Eleanor says, trying to keep her voice casual. "I found a journal that appears to have belonged to Catherine Sullivan Stone. It contains some unusual accounts that might shed light on local history." "Unusual how?" Thomas asks, curiosity evident in his voice. "One last question," Eleanor says, trying to keep her voice casual. "The photograph of the ring, do you know who took it or why?" "No idea. It was kept with the ring in that velvet box. Gran never explained it." After thanking Thomas, Eleanor hangs up and sits in thoughtful silence. The connections are too specific to be coincidence. Catherine Sullivan Stone had somehow passed the ring to her cousin Margaret, despite the journal's claim that it had been destroyed. Why? And what happened to Catherine afterward? Eleanor returns to the Historical Society, the journal and photograph secure in her bag. She needs access to records that aren't digitized. Old newspapers, police reports, anything that might shed light on Catherine's fate and the true story of the opal ring. Hours of research yield fragments of the puzzle. A small article from a neighboring town's newspaper dated February 1910 mentions an unusual incident involving a woman named Catherine Stone, who was institutionalized after attacking several people at a public market, claiming they had persecuted her decades earlier. The article noted the woman's husband, Edward Stone, had no explanation for his wife's sudden violent behavior and delusions. Eleanor finds no further mention of Catherine or Edward after that date. It's as if they vanished from history, or began new lives under different names. Finally, in a bound volume of the Millfield Gazette from August 1876, she finds it, a small article tucked between announcements of a church picnic and the birth of twins to the blacksmith's wife. Disturbance at Miller's Pond, August 15, 1876. A regrettable incident occurred Tuesday last at Miller's Pond, resulting in the death of a local woman. Victoria Blackwood, a widow residing in a cottage near the pond, was confronted by several townsmen following accusations of maleficence. It is alleged that Mrs. Blackwood's herbal remedies caused illness in the Hargrove children, though Dr. Wilson has stated the children likely suffered from natural fever. In the confusion that ensued, Mrs. Blackwood entered the pond and subsequently drowned. Mayor Sullivan has called for calm and reminded citizens that matters of justice must be left to proper authorities. Mrs. Blackwood, having no known relations, was interred in the paupers section of Millfield Cemetery yesterday. Eleanor sits back, a chill running through her despite the stuffiness of the archive room. The newspaper account confirms Victoria Blackwood's existence and death, though it presents the events in the sanitized language typical of 19th century reporting. Confronted likely meant threatened or attacked. Entered the pond probably meant was forced into the water. In the confusion that ensued, almost certainly obscured deliberate violence. She continues searching and finds one more relevant item. A letter to the editor published a week later, written by a Sarah Matthews, identifying herself as a Christian woman with concern for truth. To the editor, while I share Mayor Sullivan's desire for peace in our community, I cannot allow the circumstances of Victoria Blackwood's death to be misrepresented. I witnessed the events at Miller's Pond, having followed the crowd out of concern for what might transpire. Mrs. Blackwood did not enter the pond, as your report stated. She was dragged there by Thomas Hargrove and several others despite her protests of innocence. When she attempted to flee, she was forcibly held beneath the water until she moved no more. This was no accident or misfortune, but a deliberate act of violence against a defenseless woman. That no one has been held accountable for this crime is a stain upon our town. That our mayor counsels silence and forgetting rather than justice makes him complicit in this evil. Sarah Matthews, Oak Street. The editor had appended a note. We print this letter in the interest of open discourse, though we cannot verify the allegations contained therein. This newspaper considers the matter of Mrs. Blackwood's death closed, as do the proper authorities. Eleanor makes careful notes, documenting these contemporary accounts. Victoria Blackwood was real. She died violently at Miller's Pond, just as Catherine's journal described. And Mayor Sullivan, Catherine's great-grandfather, had indeed been involved, at least in covering up the true nature of her death. With several more hours before her meeting with Thomas, Eleanor continues searching. In a dusty box of uncatalogued materials, she discovers a small leather-bound registry from Millfield Cemetery. Flipping through the yellowed pages, she finds an entry for August 14, 1876. Victoria Blackwood, age approx. 35-40, no relations. Plot 173, Pauper's Field. Plot 173. Eleanor knows Millfield Cemetery well. The Historical Society conducts walking tours there every October. The Pauper's Field from the 1800s is now beneath the cemetery's maintenance building, constructed in the 1950s. If Victoria Blackwood's remains still rest there, they lie beneath concrete and lawn equipment, forgotten and dishonored even in death. As she's returning the cemetery registry to its box, Eleanor notices a small envelope that had been beneath it. Opening it carefully, she finds a daguerreotype, an early form of photograph, showing a woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled severely back from a high forehead, her expression solemn as she gazes at the camera. Though the technology is primitive by modern standards, the image is clear enough to recognize the same face Eleanor had seen in the opal stone. On the back, written in faded ink, Victoria Blackwood, 1874. Eleanor stares at the image, feeling a strange connection across time. The woman whose face she's looking at died tragically 2 years after this picture was taken, only to somehow return decades later through Catherine Sullivan's opal ring, if the journal is to be believed. As the Historical Society begins to fill with the day's first visitors, Eleanor carefully places her findings in a secure drawer of her desk. Then she turns her attention to the photograph of the ring, examining it once more under strong light. She hadn't checked the back of it before, assuming it contained no additional information. To her surprise, there is indeed writing on the reverse side, faint and faded but visible under her desk lamp. Using her magnifying glass, Eleanor makes out a message written in a tight, controlled hand. The binding was never broken. The merging was never completed. She waits still between worlds, neither fully here nor gone. The opal is broken, but fragments remain. Beware the face in the stone. E.S. 1953. Eleanor stares at the message, dated 45 years after the events in the journal. Edward Stone had survived at least until 1953 and had felt compelled to leave this warning with the photograph. The merging was never completed, suggesting that Catherine had somehow fought off Victoria's complete possession. She waits still between worlds, implying that Victoria Blackwood's spirit remained trapped in some liminal state, neither fully incarnate nor at rest. Most troubling is the line about the opal. Broken, but fragments remain. If the stone had been destroyed in the fireplace as described in the journal, how could fragments remain? And what might those fragments do if brought together again? Eleanor carefully places the photograph back in its archival envelope and sits at her desk, trying to process everything she's learned. The evidence suggests Catherine's journal is not fiction, but a true account of supernatural events. Victoria Blackwood existed, died violently, and somehow returned through the opal ring to seek revenge on Millfield, particularly on the descendants of those responsible for her death. But where does that leave the ring that Thomas Hayes donated? According to Catherine's final journal entry, or rather, Victoria writing in Catherine's journal, the ring had been destroyed. According to Edward's note from 1953, fragments remained. And according to Thomas, his grandmother, Margaret Sullivan Hayes, had possessed the ring and passed it down through the family. The contradictions make Eleanor's head ache. She needs more information, and Thomas Hayes might be the only one who can provide it. When Thomas arrives at the Historical Society shortly before 2 o'clock, Eleanor ushers him into her office, closing the door for privacy. He looks understandably curious and somewhat concerned. When Eleanor wakes the next morning, she makes her decision. Some stories deserve to be told, but others, perhaps, are better left in darkness. She will return the journal and photograph to the Hayes family with a note explaining their historical significance, but suggesting they remain private family artifacts rather than public exhibits. As for Catherine Sullivan's stone and the face in the wedding ring, their story will remain where it has been for over a century, hidden just beneath the surface, visible only to those who know exactly where and how to look.